Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of the Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and in keeping with our decision to observe African Guyanese History Month during August, we'll be examining today what we call African Guyanese Creole subculture. And the theme basically is well-known theme. It was a sort of paraphrasing of Marcus Garvey. A community without culture is like a tree without roots. And we feel that the African Guyanese culture, like the culture of all other people, should be celebrated. Every ethnic group, celebrates its own culture. And in this month, we celebrate African Guyanese subculture. And we look on culture as the beliefs, the behavior, customs, and the material creations of any community, of any society. And when we speak of subculture, we acknowledge that African Guyanese subculture it doesn't stand on its own. It is part of a wider culture, maybe Guyanese culture, Caribbean culture. And we feel that in Guyana, this subculture is the product of a combination of factors. For example, their retentions. Obviously, African retentions would be different from Portuguese retentions or Chinese retentions or East Indian retentions. And then there is the question of the contentious struggle for emancipation. And after emancipation, there were also contentious struggles against the planters. So the new peasants had to struggle, drainage, irrigation, taxation, and so on, against what is called the plantocracy. And of course, after 1838, the Portuguese arrived in 1834, Indians arrived in 1838, Chinese arrived in 1853, and these people interacted among themselves. And African Guyanese subculture was affected by the relations with all other people, indigenous peoples and the other migrant peoples. So when we speak of subculture, I'm not trying to be too, bookish here. We're looking at a distinct cultural group within the larger group. But this cultural group has its own interests and institutions in Guyanese society. And as I've said often before, and you've heard me, to the point of boredom, I suppose, when the first villages were established, the pioneers emphasized the importance of four pillars. The church, because most of them were Christians and most of them adhered to some form of Christianity, some denomination of Christianity. The farm, because they had to feed themselves. And again, this explodes one of the big myths that Africans didn't like farming and they fled to the towns. Of course, there were no towns then. And they stayed very much in their villages, and the majority of Africans still live in villages. And they're very efficient farmers. Their homes, and of course, as you know, during the period of enslavement, marriage was prohibited, and males and females after emancipation tried to get together. And there are stories of fathers and husbands walking all the way from Wackenham to find their spouses and their children on the East Coast, Demerara. So the reestablishment of homes was an important factor in this subculture, and schools. And again, another myth that was exploded when some Africans, having been freed, trying to get their women and children away from the plantations. This is because, of course, the women could produce more by being at home, by running their own kitchen gardens. And the children could not learn much by cutting cane, and they withdrew them from the plantation. So those are the four pillars of the African villages and African society: the church, farm, home, and school. And together, it could be argued that these pillars contributed to the cohesion um, which emerged, to the education, to faith. They all believed in God, in the high being. And important also, it contributed to food security. So these factors help to define Creole cultural identity and continuity. So this subculture was in response to the challenges of economic privation um, that they faced, having to feed themselves. It was a response to the subordination, the social subordination and political domination to which they were subjected during the period of enslavement. They wanted to be free, and that is what emancipation is all about, and that is what we celebrate in August. And their collective endeavor uh, was engendered by uh, a sequence of events which I, in my own way, I refer to as historical movements. And first of all was the emancipation movement, in which they struggled to be free. Uh, the Africans who were enslaved struggled to be free. Then there was the village movement in which they struggled to, and I say struggle because I mean they had to struggle to build the villages. There was a political movement in which they started to organize themselves to represent their interests. There's a labor movement, and as we know, the so-called founder, the father of the labor movement, was himself African Guyanese, Hubert Critchlow. And there was a cultural movement which created some of the icons of Guyanese history, like Valerie Rodway. Um, so when we speak of the evolution of this Creole culture, we see that these factors produced at first a society which was balanced, which was cohesive, which was harmonious, which was religious, and in which uh, the members derived some satisfaction or self satisfaction. And these factors, the balance and cohesion and harmony and religious belief, help to create a fairly stable, not a rich society, but a stable society. The question therefore arises is, to what extent was this emergent subculture, uh, you know, contributory to the development of society, and to what extent did the culture retain some of the beliefs and behavior and customs of the African continent from which they came? Bear in mind that many enslaved Africans only lived for about 12 years because the work was so hard and so cruel that you did not really have a lot of old people, because most of the time the planters depended on replenishment by new shipments. But after the slave trade was abolished, many of the people living in British Guiana at that time had to prolong their lives. Um, and in so doing, they remembered what life was like when they were children, when they were young people in the villages in Africa from which they were captured. And as a result of that, there was an influence on dance, on art, drama, uh, dress, and you can see people try to recapture that spirit, that dress on 1st of August. Folklore, and we all know what we call Nancy stories, although we use the word Anansi in a separate sense, but people are aware of folklore, literature, music, and the attentiveness to drumming and uh, a lot of the folk songs that we grew up with, um, grew up hearing are, of course, songs which were written by folk knockers or by villagers. Um, and then, of course, the personal names, which still persist to the present time, their oral traditions, the speech, the way we speak, sometimes is quite incomprehensible to non-Guyanese. Um, the way we go about storytelling and there are other religious rituals. Uh, but you can look at all, of course, I cannot deal with them now. But when you look at the sheer scale of cultural activities, you would see that this subgroup has distinctive traits which differentiate um, it, the group from other groups. It's not better or worse, but it's different. That is the point we're trying to make. And we can look, for example, at speech. Again, as I said, in this time, the time available to me, we can't be too exhaustive. But we use some words every day which are typical of retentions. For example, Anansi is actually a Twi word meaning spider. We speak of fufu as a form of food, um, pounded plantain, and it is actually a word still in use in Ghana. And we speak of kokobe, some people speak of kokobe, which is, you know, it's leprosy. Now, I don't hear the term very frequently nowadays, but it means it's a leprosy, a disease. We speak of kanki. Some people have tried to refine the term to konki. The actual word is kanki, K-A-N-K-I. We speak of metemji. We speak of kwekwe as well. Again, I just like to remind you that in my knowledge, maybe things have changed. In my knowledge, the Twi language does not have the letter C or Q. So there's no real C-U-F-F-Y, it's K-O-F-I, and there's no Q-E, Q-E, kwekwe, it is K-W-E, K-W-E, because the letter C just doesn't exist. So there's kwekwe, which we are familiar with or you heard about, whether you've actually been to a kwekwe ceremony or not. And then there's metemji, which some people insist on calling metaji. Of course, there's no such thing as metaji, but we'll come to that some other time. And there are a lot of expressions which Professor Richard Alsop, who is, world-renowned lexicographer, has brought to our attention because they are of African origin, not the actual words, but the way the expressions are used. For example, I pass, cut eye, hard ears, softy. These are typical Creolese terms. And it is sometimes astonishing to see judges and lawyers using these expressions in official documents. And, a minister accuses the United States Department of State of I pass. I'm sure that the U.S. State Department would have to rush to some dictionary to find what is I pass or hard ears. But these are Creole expressions which most Guyanese understand, whether they're African Guyanese or not. But these expressions are part of the sort of Creole speech. And a lot of personal names have survived. Unbroken, these were not invented by some organization a few years ago. These were always there. For example, in the Akan tradition, day names are common, as you know from the international community. Kwesi, for a short period in Britain, there was a finance minister, Chancellor of the Exchequer, whose first name was Kwasi, which is the same as Kwesi. It means that he was born on a Sunday, and the female is a Kwashiba. And we've heard about folk stories about Kwashiba. Sometimes it's spelled Quashib, but it's a Kwashiba. Um, uh, Children born on Tuesdays were named Kojo. Again, in Guyana, we spell it Kojo, but the authentic spelling is Kwadw, Kojo, and the female is Ador. Uh, Wednesday, a male name is Kwabina and female name is Abina. Uh, Thursday, the male name is Kwaku or Kweku, and the female name is Akua. Um, and Friday name is Kofi, and the female name is Afua. And Saturday, the male name is Kwame, and the female name is Ama. So you can see that these names have never disappeared. If you go in the countryside, you'll see people whose old folk who bear some of these names, and of course in the international community, as I said, former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan. This would suggest that he's of Akan origin, and of course the British Minister of Finance. So these names also existed over 200 years in villages in Guyana. They were not sudden injections or inventions. They've been there all the time because those are the only names they knew. And of course, the British planters tried to give them new names. Sometimes they're named after planets like Jupiter and Mars or Venus or something. But very many of the parents knew the significance of their ethnic names, and they retained those. It's not a matter of rejection, but that is what they knew, and that is what they adhered to. In addition to that, African Guyanese material culture is very noticeable around the country. And this is because they acquired skills during the period of enslavement. Plantations required artisans, carpenters, coopers, sail makers, smiths, wheelwrights, who transferred those talents to the improvement of their properties after emancipation. And if you got an idea what Guyana was like, British Guyana was like in the middle of the last century, you would see that those skills were very important. I don't know if many people nowadays can attempt to make a wheel for a donkey cart or to make a vat, but a vat was constructed without iron nails, and you need to be very skilled. The casks which held rum or molasses or sugar had to be constructed without the use of nails. So the coopers who made them were very skilled person, and I'm very proud that my grandfather himself was a cooper, and one of the heirlooms of our family was an adze, ADZE. I'm not sure many people would know what an adze is nowadays, but it meant that the artisans who came out of the period of enslavement in the early days after emancipation were very skilled, and they were able to manufacture carts and casks and bats and of course musical instruments, banjos, drums, and flutes, and other things that they needed. And they also created art, furniture, monuments, structures, tools, and utensils which they had to use. And they built their own bateau, um, uh, small canoes. They built churches, they built homes and schools and other means of production. And handicraft was passed down through the ages. They made their own ceramic vessels, and they used calabashes, and did tremendous amount of basket weaving. And a few years ago, it was still common to have furniture, made from mukru, nibi, and tibisiri, which is similar. It might have been copied from the indigenous people, but these were easily available, made out of local material in the villages. The question, therefore, is what value did African Guyanese place on these cultural retentions? and talents, and how did they contribute to social cohesion? How did they articulate their opinions, and how were the communities led? These are important considerations that emerge out of this subculture that the African Guyanese community shared. Um, some of you may not know, but one of the first newspapers in this country that was not controlled by the Europeans was the Freeman Sentinel, 4 years after emancipation, when most of the freed persons were still illiterate. They were able to produce a newspaper called the Freeman Sentinel. It means exactly what it says. It was a sentinel on guard for the interests of free men. And another one was produced called the Creole. This is by 1856 or thereabouts. So you can see the African Guyanese made an early start in newspaper publishing in order to set forth their opinions and their views about society. And maybe on another occasion we could go into more detail about that. It's an important contribution to national culture, not just the culture of one set of people. Another interesting fact is that in the early 20th century, under the leadership of a man from Denhamsdale called James McFarlane Curry, something called the Cooperative Credit Bank was introduced. Mr. Curry was, he regarded as, Guyana has a lot of fathers. You know, Hubert Critchlow was father of trade unionism. Curry was father of local government. He was really chairman of the first village chairman's conference. All of the village chairmen were brought together, and he was the first chairman. But he had this idea that, you know, cooperative credit banks could provide credit, loans to farmers, and of course the farmers would pay back those loans. And well, the farmers were very poor, and I don't think they ever had the sufficient capital, but it worked for a decade or two before it ended. Unfortunately, Mr. Curry died too. But the banks were functioning, most of the villages, and it was not an ethnic bank. Poor Indian farmers were able to access loans from the Cooperative Credit Bank as well. And as you know very well, many Guyanese at a different level had a boksan. So they had a concept of thrift, of saving as well. And the boksan helped families to circumvent the difficulties that they faced when they went to the big banks. Well, I'm not sure boksans, still exists, but that was one of the inventions, I can say, or the retentions of African Guyanese. And it should not be forgotten that most African Guyanese adhere to some form of Christianity. And as early as 1808, Reverend John Ray came and established what became essentially the Congregational Church from 1808. And I think the Mission Chapel Church in New Amsterdam is one of the oldest. And whether or not you're a Congregationalist, you must accept that the role of the Congregational Church in evangelizing Africans, even during enslavement, and more so after the period of enslavement, after emancipation, is without equal. And they built a lot of schools and churches, and because of the nature of Congregationalism, there was no hierarchy. You know, there were no cardinals and archbishops and so on. The congregations themselves, you know, played an important role in the way these communities, these churches were run. But the form of Christianity which most of them adopted, was, I would say, nonconformist. Um, they were certainly not Roman Catholic or Anglican. But they have the congregations have a place of pride in Guyanese history, especially in providing secular and religious education to the non-European population. And of course, in terms of material culture, there's so many monuments um, which seem to characterize um, African Guyanese communities. Uh, Again, if you go in the countryside, you'll see that the Friendship Village is an emancipation monument built in 1938, celebrating the centenary of emancipation. In Kildonan, on the Quarantine, there's the Independence Monument. In Plaisance, there's another Independence Monument on the East Coast. Union Village, on the Quarantine, there's an Independence Monument. Victoria Village has an Emancipation Monument. Bachelor's Adventure has a monument commemorating the 1823 revolt. As you know, this is the centenary year, and most of the slaughter occurred at Bachelor's Adventure on the East Coast, Demerara. And there's a monument, a very simple, unpretentious monument, but the people of Bachelor's Adventure know that the soil of that village was covered with blood on the morning of the 20th of August, 1823. And there's some other monuments, of course, the Demerara, Berbice, and Essequibo revolts have monuments in Georgetown for Demerara and Georgetown for Berbice. And the Essequibo monument is at Anna Regina. And there are also monuments that honor or pay homage to eminent personalities. At Bagotville, well, I have been there for a while. There was a monument to Jake Croker, who was a significant folklorist some years ago. And then Amstel, there's a monument to James McFarlane Curry. In Georgetown, of course, there's a monument to, well, a mausoleum to Forbes Burnham. And in the National Assembly grounds, Parliament grounds, there's a monument to Hubert Critchlow, the father of trade unionism. So you can see that it is a characteristic feature of African Guyanese subculture to establish monuments to these events and these personalities. The question before us now is, how does this subculture perpetuate itself? How does it continue? Is it of any value? And we feel that one way of perpetuating these traditions is through the efforts of non-governmental organizations. And there are numerous non-governmental organizations. Again, on another occasion, we can look at some of them, but some of the most prominent now are ACDA, the African Cultural and Development Association. There's the 1st of August movement that used to exist in Buxton. There's a Pan-African movement. The late Professor Justin Lump was head of that. There was the RAPAC, and the late Professor Rogers Borbishan was head of that. There's several others. Unfortunately, they're not well known, and I think sometimes the membership tends to fall off once the leader dies or disappears. And we know now that one of the most vibrant non-governmental organizations is the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly in Guyana. And that is really managing the International Decade up to the period of the 31st of December next year, 2024. And one of the emphases of the International Decade is the perpetuation of African culture. That is to say, to promote greater knowledge of and respect for the diverse heritage, culture, and contribution of people of African descent. My friends, African Guyanese subculture has helped to sustain a significant portion of the Guyanese population, maybe numbering about 250,000 today. And its aim then at the start, and its aim in continuing, should be to foster a balanced and cohesive community, a harmonious community, a religious community, a self satisfied community. Cultural customs could contribute to social cohesion. And I say, in my view, I would say that the preservation of identity is important, preserving those four pillars, the church, farm, home, and school, which help to foster solidarity, self-esteem, and self-sufficiency. Uh, and sometimes you insist on farming, you insist on going to school, you insist on having a family home, you insist on going to church. They all contribute to, harmonious societies, cohesive society. Another value is intelligence in order to overcome ignorance. Uh, in other words, there should be education so that future generations are aware of how these values are reinforced, values of cohesion and harmony, and um, you know having stable societies, stable communities. And it also leads to parents and families ensuring that their children receive formal education from childhood uh, up to university, and also technical and vocational levels of education. So we were aiming at building a community of intelligent people, not a community of ignorant people. Um, a third means of advancing or perpetuating culture is information that is beyond the classroom. Information should be used to, as this program does, provide, knowledge about people's histories, about where we came from, and how we got here, what factors militated for cohesion or against cohesion, particularly using all available means, using film, using radio, using social media to get that information across, and infrastructure. Without infrastructure, and villages started off with very poor infrastructure, built in, 19th century or sometimes 18th century, dams, back dams. That infrastructure has to be modernized. In addition to that, new infrastructure to support, to provide the economic basis for agro-processing, factories, for drainage and irrigation, canals, especially in the coastal areas, need to be maintained. Nowadays in farming, you have to build shade houses to protect your crops against climate change. And all these things contribute to augmenting production. In other words, African Guyanese Creole subculture made an important contribution to the culture of the whole country, and is best preserved and perpetuated through education. The United Nations International Decade for People of African Descent is a unique, once in a lifetime opportunity for African Guyanese to concentrate their energies on creating a good life, not only for themselves, but also for future generations. Thank you, and may God bless you.